Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be discussing a book which I've mentioned in a few previous videos, The Girls in the Wild Fig Tree by Nice Leng'ete, and my apologies in advance if I inadvertently mispronounce any of these names or put the accent on the wrong syllable, but hopefully my intentions will be understood as respectful. This is about a young woman from the African Maasai tribe. I'm not going to really go into much details about the Maasai culture, things like that. It's beyond the scope of what I'm focusing on in this review, but she does tell many wonderful stories about Maasai history and culture throughout the book. She's very proud of her people and their culture, even though she obviously understands there are certain rituals that should be discontinued in the modern era because they don't have any purpose or value or don't make any sense. Like, for example, obviously FGM and a few other things, but she's very proud of being Maasai. She was born in Numaiyanat, Kenya, which is near the town of Kimana, by the border with Tanzania, and they can see Mount Kilimanjaro in the background. And in her backyard, growing up, there were all sorts of wild animals like elephants, giraffes, vervet monkeys, baboons, and wildebeest. And there were also some lions here and there, but obviously the lions weren't really a threat to them. They just were there, sometimes. And she talks in several chapters about how her father became head of the Kenyan Wildlife Service in the game reserves, and how it was really an important big step for actual native Kenyans to take control of these game reserves and preserve the land and the animals and do conservation and prevent hunting and poaching and things like that, because in the past these white Westerners, the descendants of colonialists, had been in charge of the game preserves and land and things like that. And it was just a great big triumph for the Kenyans to take back control of their land, their territory, their tribes, and handle things the way they had always historically done, because they obviously understood their own native culture and land far better than these people with no connection to the land. So it's just something really special that happened, and that was a big inspiration that her father provided for her. And also I'll talk about later, it inspired her to help end FGM from the inside by someone who's actually part of the Maasai culture, not some wealthy white Westerner coming in and saying they need to stop their native culture. So the Maasai live a very simple lifestyle off of the land in very small, simple cinder block houses with only one or two rooms, and they have small beds on them, and they really don't spend much time in their house at all during the day. It's mostly just to sleep or maybe to eat sometime on and off during the day. Other than that, they're always constantly working the land. They raise cattle, sheep, and goats. They grow some vegetables tomatoes and onions, but not really many other vegetables. Many of them have never even tasted things like chicken or cucumbers, because that's just not traditionally part of the Maasai culture. It's just a very, very simple back to the earth type of farming and grazing lifestyle. And they don't do any hunting of the wild animals either. They just get all their meat from the animals they raise themselves. And if you've read The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs, the Maasai lifestyle seems similar to the street ballet, which Mrs. Jacobs famously describes. The children are constantly out playing in the outdoors all the time, when these adults constantly keep their eye on them, so they can tell the parents or other elders of the community, oh, did you know what Janie and Jimmy were doing today? Or they stop crimes, or just basically keep the eyes on the street. So they're basically policing their own communities. And there's also an open door policy. If this is your extended family, or this you went through the coming of age ceremony with this person when you were adolescents, you're basically all connected. You're welcome to come in people's houses, and they'll provide you with food and shelter. And even if these people are strangers, you're walking through the area on your way to boarding school after vacation, and or just traveling to the big city to do some business or something, and you run across other Maasai because your feet are getting tired, or you're hungry, or it's getting dark out, they'll take you into their homes without question and give you food and a place to stay, because that's just what people do. It's a lovely, sweet, hospitable environment. It might be simple, but it's their culture, and they're very proud of who they are. That Nice doesn't like all the things about Maasai culture. She feels there are certain customs that need to be discontinued in the modern era because they're not really any value. When she was a child, she refused the custom when they would heat a hot wire coil on a fire until it's burning like bright orange, and then they would put it on the child's cheeks so it burns circles on them, and she like ran away from it. Her parents unfortunately spanked her when she refused it, and then she refused it a second time, and they beat her even harder. But they kind of realized she's not gonna do this, and that kind of set the stage for her to refuse FGM as she got older. When she was about 3 or 4 years old, her mother took her to see the first cutting ceremony as preparation for what her mother believed was her inevitable fate, and it was absolutely like horrible. The girl was, screaming and shaking violently, and like just terrible pain, so much blood. And like a few days later, the girl got a fever, and then a few more days later, the girl passed away, and people blamed it on a curse instead of the fact that they were, cutting this girl's genitals off with a disgusting, dirty razor for like absolutely no medical reason at all. A lot of people who practice FGM say, "Oh, this people were cursing this, or this woman is secretly a witch or something," and not admitting this is like disgusting and unhygienic and barbaric, and they just don't, realize like modern science does not support this at all. You know, FGM, obviously the procedure itself causes pain, but even after, if you've survived, it continues causing pain sometimes. Like particularly like survivors have said, it hurts to like urinate or menstruate, and it can also cause problems with like infertility or get infections. Obviously, loss of any sexual pleasure, and their childbirth becomes more dangerous, and you have urinary tract infections, and obviously like PTSD, just like terrible trauma, like a legitimate triggers and like post-traumatic stress disorder from surviving this like horrible procedure. And if you don't get the cut, you're still seen as a little girl. You're not seen as a woman, and therefore like you will never be able to marry or have children because you're not a woman. Although once you get when the girls get the cut, they're generally like 12 years old or so, and so they're obviously still like physically and legally children, but they're seen as women in the community because they had part of their genitals cut off, and they're like always, most of the time they're married off to much older men, and sometimes as the second, third, or fourth wife, and they begin having children almost immediately. It's just a horrible, terrible cycle. And if a woman or a girl does not have FGM, she and her family are shamed as like pariahs. So it's basically like don't get above your raising thing, like just live what you know. That's also something that has been keeping it alive, unfortunately, for many centuries. And Ms. Leng'ete, she had several like family tragedies when she was growing up. I'm not going to spoil it or get too much into those kinds of details, but there were a lot of losses she had in her family, and unfortunately, when she was 7 years old, both of her parents died fairly close together of AIDS. Like that was a big source of shame for the community. She didn't know the real reason they passed away right away, because this was, I guess, back in the 90s, I would assume, or maybe even the 80s. I'm not quite sure what her age is. I'm assuming she's like somewhat close in age to me, and just AIDS was like didn't have as many like drugs to control it in those days, and her parents suffered horribly. There wasn't much hope for them, and after she became orphaned, her older sister Soila, again, sorry I'm mispronouncing this, they were sent to live with various relatives, and they were exploited with very hard work. The wonderful like inheritance fund, like their father had worked very hard for over many decades of his life. Not only did he work at the game preserve, he also worked in Kenyan government. These greedy, like opportunistic relatives stole like all the money from their fund, and they were like abused by relatives. Nice's grandpap did treat her like very nicely, and his wife at the time was also lovely to her, but unfortunately he was became a widower, and he married a second woman, and she was horrible to Nice. She was constantly like beating the little girl, and like her aunt, I believe, was also beating her a lot, and just like horrible, like terrible things were happening in her family because her parents were no longer there to protect her, and they had held their money stolen by like greedy scumbags in the family. Her auntie Grace, her mother's sister, who was a Christian, and her grandfather were kind to her, and like basically everyone else like didn't treat her so nicely, or at least not in her like family. Obviously, in the wider Maasai community, they were nice. I'm sorry if there's some noise from outside. And her grandfather agreed to send her to a boarding school, which was like a few days walk away because like Nice really wanted to get an education. She had always loved school. It was an hour away from the town of Kimana by car and like several days walking by foot. Most of the students and the teachers there weren't Maasai because when a Maasai girl gets FGM, her education automatically stops, or if it doesn't stop right then, it just stops within a few months because she's going to get married off soon and start having kids, so she can't be going to school anymore. And so, therefore, most of the girls, women she was interacting with were uncut, and that was kind of revolutionary for her. And she began to realize maybe I don't have to have this after all, because she didn't have, as I mentioned, a lot of money to afford this boarding school. It's not like what we in the West would consider a boarding school, like some hoity-toity, like expensive prep school. It was just, a more decent school than the basic education she would have in the village. She worked in the fields in a laundry to earn some money to keep going to school. It was hard work, but it wasn't as difficult as when she was being exploited by her relatives. And she did, earn money. Sometimes she had to take time off of school because she had to work to bring in more money to afford her tuition, but the breaks were never very long. And she would go home on the school breaks. And one of these breaks, her uncle was planning an FGM ceremony for his three daughters and Nice and her older sister Soila. They were just going to combine the money, save money and resources, and just basically do all five girls at one time, so they wouldn't have to slaughter the meat and pay money for the women's clothes and all the other special things that went into this ceremony on 5 different occasions. So Nice and her sister Soila, they hid for a few days. They hid in a fig tree by the house, and then they ran to their Auntie Grace, who sheltered them. But 2 days after that, male relatives found them and beat them terribly. Grace had to watch her nieces being disgustingly beaten and abused, but the girls did successfully avoid FGM, although they were shamed. And Nice continued going to school after that, and she begged her grandpa, please let me continue going to school. My parents valued education very much. How can my education continue, and how can I have much of any future if I get FGM so early? She was only 8, about to turn 9 years old at the time, which was several years younger than it was usually done. And her grandfather realized, yeah, okay, I'll give you 6 more months to go to school. And then she would ask him several other times, can I have 6 more months, and then can I have a year, until finally she made him realize, okay, you can just go throughout school until high school. And then he eventually realized, okay, this my granddaughter is never getting the cut, and that's okay. And even though people were shaming her and saying terrible things about her and treating her poorly, they couldn't go against her grandpa, because he was an elder in the community, and you always respect an elder even if you don't agree with the things he's doing, which people in the West could learn a lot from, about respecting your elders and not constantly disrespecting them and acting like more than people decades older than you, just because you're woke and you're 21 and you have blue hair and pronouns in the bio. And so and he realized the cut would never happen. But unfortunately, Nice's sister Soila wasn't so fortunate. When a year later they were going to do the ceremony again for the 2 sisters, they weren't going to do a special thing again, this fresh meat and a big community celebration and nice new clothes and jewelry to mark their becoming women, because they had brought shaman everyone. They were just going to cut them and be done with it. And Soila decided to stop hiding. She was going to go through with it. Maybe Nice would get away if she went and got her, unfortunately, FGM and was married, because that would maybe clear the way for Nice to get away with going to school and continuing her education, where she wouldn't. And predictably, at the age of 12, after being cut, Soila was married off to a much older man. She was much younger than he was, and also she was his second wife. And by the time she was 17 years old, they already had 3 boys. And on one visit home from school, Nice talked to her about birth control. She said, look, there are ways you can get secret invisible birth control your husband will never know about. And she went to Kimana on business to drop off produce or meat or something a few times a year, and she would get injected with birth control. And she thankfully stopped at 3 children. She wasn't forced to keep having children every year and a half or whatever, with her body being worn out before she was even 20 years old. And when Nice came home on school break, she began talking to local girls, and she convinced a few not to get the cut. When she was about 16 years old, she joined a group called AMREF, which stands for African Medical and Research Foundation, and provides young people with like training and education about health and how to talk to people in their communities about things like vaccines and clean water and stuff, and how to educate them. And she used this the beginning job to teach people in her community and learn how to teach them about like AIDS and STDs, vaccines, nutrition, hygiene, sanitation, like water, birth control, like safer types ways to give like childbirth, reusable menstrual products, which is a huge problem for girls in Africa. Many of them have to miss school when they have their period because there aren't a lot of like menstrual products available in Africa, unfortunately. And so that was also like a very good cause she brought awareness to. And also she learned about the scientific reasons for why you shouldn't have female genital mutilation and the dangers of them. She obviously knew it was like terrible and painful and could cause like bleeding and death and things like that, but she never knew about like the scientific reasons why it's such a like total like tomfoolery and poppycock and just horse feathers and terrible things you shouldn't do. So now she was in an extra position to oppose it and speak against it, because she didn't just like have a personal like aversion to it. She actually knew why it should not be done like medically and scientifically. So when she was 18, she graduated from her boarding school, high school, and she went to university in Nairobi. And she mentions a lot in the book like about her like adventures and learning how to live in the real world outside of like a small protected Maasai village, and like had her eyes open to things she like never even like knew about, like the uglier side of humanity and things like that. But more happier, she got some like more in-depth training and experience when she was taking her university classes, so she could be an even better advocate against FGM and improving health and sanitation in her village. And she found out there are some people who do like it's kind of like a sanitized or I guess cleaned up FGM ceremony in a hospital, which like antibiotics and sterilization, where it's like just a small incision instead of like cutting off entire parts of the genitals. But even if that would happen like in a controlled like clean hospital environment, and it was just basically more symbolic than like anything else, it still robs females, girls of their bodily autonomy, and it would still result in an early marriage and motherhood and dropping out of school early, because girls are seen as women the moment they get FGM. So even if it's like so controlled and like cleaned up and stuff, they're it's something terrible that shouldn't happen. And she also talks about how like men support FGM because they believe it creates like better wives and mothers, and they just genuinely historically have not understood the real thing going on, because it was seen as a women's issue, and the sexes don't really mix or like talk about things like that. That's only specific to like one sex. And she says like boys also have to drop out of school early too, because once they're getting married, they have to support a family, and they can't like waste time going to school for like until they're 18 or like 25 years old or whatever. They have to start getting farming or work somewhere, and it's just like makes like more sense like from the traditional belief system they have to not be in school and just like continue this like tradition without even like questioning the reasons. And it's also seen as central to Maasai identity. And as I believe I mentioned earlier, Nice isn't like anti-Maasai at all. She has great pride and love for her culture. She just realizes there are certain things about it that shouldn't continue in the modern era, and she can like love her culture and respect it while still incorporating like things from the modern West, like for example eating like Western foods sometimes and doing other things that aren't like traditionally or historic part of Maasai, as long as she honors her culture at the heart. And Kenya did outlaw FGM in 2011, but it continued underground, and that made the practice even unsafer, because they're going to lie to law enforcement about it, and it'll be done in even more like disgusting and it's worse, even worse, terrible like conditions. Like for example, I believe it was 1912, China like officially outlawed foot binding, but it did like continue underground, particularly in like, smaller villages and among poor families, until like 1949. It was just more dangerous and underground. So that's basically what happens when you like outlaw a practice like that without like getting rid of it at the root and explaining to people why it shouldn't be continued. So basically, you just have to think through a lot of factors when you do this. And Nice began making inroads into this fight against FGM by talking to mothers about the economic impact of this. Like, for example, on the death risk, the fevers, pains, like education being interrupted, and the importance of education. And when you like drop out of school early, get married at all of 12 years old, and start, you have like 5, 10 kids by the time you're 25 years old, you have more mouths to feed and clothes. And so that's just like a terrible, like destructive cycle, and FGM plays like a big part in continuing that terrible cycle. And she began, like, these mothers, like a light bulb started turning on in them, and she couldn't talk to any of the men at first because they don't want to talk to her about women's issues, like very, very private, intimate stuff. And also she was seen as an entapai, I hope I'm pronouncing that correct, someone who's shameful because she had refused the cut, and she wasn't seen as a real woman because she hadn't had FGM. So she had to co-host meeting with the men, at first only young unmarried men, with her friend Douglas around her age, who had also gone through the OMREF training her when she was 16. That was the only way she could gain an audience with the men, and they didn't really want to speak to her at first. It was only Douglas, but gradually they came around and began like respecting and listening to her. And she and Douglas, they opened the discussion by discussing vaccine clinics, like clean water and other programs offered by OMREF and NGOs. Like, it wasn't about FGM at all. You have to like gradually like catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Just gradually lead into the conversation and like build up to it. Build their trust first. Don't just like come at them with like guns blazing and declare, oh, you're terrible, like bigots and stuck in the Middle Ages and such like that. Just know your audience and gradually like educate them and bring them to like a greater understanding. Don't start from the presumption they're like inherently like immoral and like deliberately ignorant. And then she led the conversation gradually towards FGM. She talked about how it causes loss of sexual pleasure, and don't you want your wives to enjoy sex? And if your wife isn't enjoying sex, do you think she's going to be happy or grumpy? And do you want a happy wife or a wife who's grumpy all the time? And she also mentioned like other health risks they hadn't been aware of, like the death risk and the harm to fertility and the risk of, God forbid, dying in childbirth. And these men just genuinely never knew that, and they obviously want healthy children like every person in their right mind does. And so they realize maybe this isn't the good thing we've been led to believe it always has been. And these young men, the Morans, they agreed to help with ending FGM in the village. And finally, after working for over 3 years, they did wonderfully end FGM in her village. And she's helped with like getting rid of it in many other places in Kenya and around the world. And like, she realized that this kind of change needs to happen from the inside by someone who has actually lived in that community and been part of it for many years and understands like the culture and the history and what makes them tick, not by some like white Westerners coming in and like imposing their like morality and like cultural constructs or whatever on people who like live a much different lifestyle. And so it's just like something really important to consider. And she like developed something called alternative rites of passage. Like, for example, it would be in the West, a girl getting like a quinceañera or a bat mitzvah or like some like confirmation in the church, things like that. And it, they do everything they would do traditionally in the FGM ceremony, like the banquet with the freshly slaughtered meat and the lovely new beautiful clothes and jewelry to mark becoming a woman, like singing songs and celebrating it. It ends with a little candlelight procession, like singing about the girl's future and the no need to avoid FGM and how they're like starting a lovely new like future and different paths for themselves. And it's just like a very important fight to end this disgusting barbaric practice. And it does not have any basis in any religion practicing it, like, or people belonging to a religion practicing it, like Christianity or Islam. This is just something people, like men, invented themselves. But unfortunately, women have been keeping the tradition alive because they just, it's not like deliberate ignorance, they just genuinely don't know these things. I think they have to keep it alive to, like, oh, we won't get husbands for our daughters or something, like the same way some other women in Africa do, like something called breast ironing to keep the girls' breasts from growing, so like men won't find them attractive, or so they can look like girls longer and like stay in school and postpone marriage. It's just like there are lots of like horrible abuses of like women and girls around the world, which need to stop. So hopefully I wasn't too rambling and you enjoyed my look at the book. There are many other things I didn't mention in the book. She does talk a lot about like her stories growing up and her family and her like parents, how they met and such like that, and like the Maasai culture, lovely stories from their folklore, and her father's work with like the Kenyan Wildlife Service and the game preserves and the government, and obviously more details about how she was exploited and abused and had the money stolen by the relatives, and like her adventures and going to school in Nairobi. But I really like did enjoy this book. It's like a very important read for everyone, and like ending FGM is a very virtuous, like worthwhile cause, and like hopefully, God willing, it will someday be discontinued completely and not just driven underground by unsavory practitioners. They believe about 200 million women and girls around the world have been subject to FGM. It's just absolutely no excuse for cutting off even like part of a girl's genitals, and like some of the more extreme parts, which weren't done in the Maasai village. I believe they had just had type 1, which is a like mildest form, although obviously like there's nothing mild about cutting off part of a woman's genitals. But they like type 4 and 5 were like cutting off everything and like sewing the girl up in fibrillation, which causes even greater pain for menstruation, urination, and childbirth. And she has to be like cut open like when she goes to give birth or when her husband wants sex, which makes it even more painful. It's just like a horrible, like barbaric practice all around. And thank God I was not born into a part of the world that practices this horrible, horrible custom. So thank you very much for listening to my discussion of this important book, and I will see you guys very soon. Thanks. Bye.